Welcome to Before Bedtime. Give me all your fear. The road to Plainfield did not appear on modern maps. It was merely a gravel scar threading between cornfields and stands of pine. In autumn, when fog crawled low over the ground like something ashamed, car headlights cut circles of light that died fast, as if the world was trying to hoard the dark. Locals spoke of the old farm with the kind of caution you reserve for a knife. You keep it on the table, but you never use it without looking at it. She knew the place from whispers and yellowed clippings. A wooden house, a reserved man, odd habits. Stories had swollen over the years, like mold, distorted by the warmth of imagination. When the reporter arrived in Plainfield, she did not seek sensationalism. She wanted to understand how the shadow of a single life could cross decades and cling to a community's walls. She did not expect what she found. The farm lay sunk in its own silence. A one-story house with a fence falling apart and windows that looked inward like piers. There was no garden, no flowers, no recent tracks at the gate. Only the feeling that the place had been built to repel visitors. Doors opening onto hallways too short, staircases that led to blank walls, rooms that returned questions instead of answers. Inside, everything seemed frozen in some ordinary life that no one lived anymore. The kitchen held jars of preserves. A dry loaf sat on a cutting board. In the parlor, a rocking chair pointed toward the center of the room, as if its occupant had just stood up. Tools and newspapers dated years back rested on shelves. Dust had settled in its own rhythm across every surface, as if time had decided to stay put. Neighbors, initially reticent, eventually spoke to the reporter. They described a man rigid with routines, a son raised by a devout and watchful mother. Many said that devotion had become something far beyond love. She pieced the legend carefully. A mother who imposed a code of purity, who dictated what was acceptable and what deserved shame, who decided who should be loved and who feared. The mother died. The man remained alone in the house, and with the idea of her presence more than her company. He ventured out seldom. He bought necessities and returned with the same blank expression and a voice that never rose. The 1950s brought half measures of modern life. Radios playing in tonal black and white, neon signs in town, shining cars on the road promising less dust and more money. He stayed, an exception to plans that left him out. In that isolation, he learned to fill voids with objects, scraps of stories, and whatever death left at the edges of his acts. It's easy, in retrospect, to turn detail into monster. Small choices made monstrous by retelling. But the tiny decisions, the seemingly harmless habits shaped the tragedy. He maintained crafts for years, cutting, stitching, repairing, collecting. Hands used to wood and rope learned the rhythm of stitches in the dark. Many imagined those skills went to preserving the home, mending chairs, sewing vests. No one guessed the cloths came from a different source. When the police arrived at the farm, it was for something mundane. The disappearance of a woman who ran a small business in town. Her name appeared on an official missing person record and in her sister's memory. A phone call led to another. An item. A smear of blood. Directions pointed quietly to the man whom few dared name. The house offered no resistance. They entered as one enters an assumed empty room. Measured steps, flashlights cutting pale beams through the dust. What silence hid was more than lost objects. Scattered through the house and barn were artifacts shaped like domestic life, but made of a material no one should have used. Skin, bone, fragments of human remains. These discoveries answered no logic, only a strange compound of devotion, illness, and memory. The pieces seemed assembled by someone trying to restore a lost presence, to recreate companionship taken by death. The result was not simply grotesque, it was a material confession of loneliness. In the barn and house, they found jars and containers. Skulls peered from shelves like trophies. A shirt stitched of a texture the police took time to identify. A suit composed of parts gathered with a patience that chilled, meant to wrap a figure around a body. In the kitchen, common utensils sat beside remnants that did not belong at a family table. Each find pushed back against disbelief. The horror was as ordinary as the oil on a skillet. The man did not offer much resistance when detained. His gaze was the dull look of someone who had reduced the world to a few rules. In his statement, he spoke of his mother with the insistence of a scripture that would not be interrupted. how she had dictated right and wrong, how reality had to conform to a tale of purity and sin. His words repeated a learned script: death, the insistence that cleanliness was obedience, the idea that a body could be transformed to answer absence. Doctors put cooler names to the collision of senses. They diagnosed severe mental illness, delusions, a morbid fixation that mixed necrophilia with obsessive preservation. The court, in precise terms, attempted to assess his capacity to distinguish right from wrong. The verdict was insanity. No conventional prison sentence followed. Instead, there were institutions and exams, padded rooms, and attempts to keep him apart from society for the public good. The press would not be content with technicalities. Hungry for headlines, papers spun the case into runaway fable. Sensational titles invented victim counts, fed nocturnal panic, and photographed the house to exhaustion. Judicial and medical truths tangled with rumor. That bodies had been stacked, that the house served as a macabre altar to an addiction to death. None of those wild versions captured the mix of wounded ego, nostalgia, and madness that had driven the acts. Still, once the image is planted, it grows in the culture's imagination. Writers and filmmakers found a useful archetype there. A man whose solitude and lacks could be read in 1,000 ways. They took fragments and rearranged them until the figure became a mythic template, the lonely neighbor who harbors the potential for monstrous deeds. Fiction chose with relish the most extreme traits and dramatized them for easier fear. Characters were born to stalk screens, each carrying versions of the house, the suit, and the silence. For families who lost someone, official answers did little to ease grief. For the town, the farm became a scar. People crossed the street to avoid its shadow. Others used the tale to warn children. Fear left its mark on conversation, on routes that skirted the old house, on how grandmothers told the story at night, never explicit, but just enough for imagination to fill in the rest. In time, the farm was razed. The wood and nails that had heard so many voices were stacked and burned. Residents hoped the fire might cleanse more than a surface. Perhaps it would erase the house's power to summon memory or stop tourists from arriving with flashlights to peer at the ecosystem of horror. But memory does not burn with lumber. What the flames consumed kept fingering at minds. The man's image lived on in medical files, and official photographs preserved with the expression of someone less an individual than a community problem. He spent his remaining years under psychiatric custody, with sporadic visits and the constant company of clinicians, trying to unravel the logic of a mind that had found something like an answer in death. There was never public reconciliation with victims. Their names remained in press notes and a few lines in case files for curious researchers. One detail the reporter could not shake: the bedroom where a mattress should have been. Instead of bedding, there was a plank of wood. The place carried not a domestic smell, but a funerary odor, not merely death, but an attempt to preserve a presence. She found a crudely bound book with handwritten notes, phrases about obedience, the need not to betray what the mother had taught. Along the paper's edges were stains time could not explain. Those words reduced the house's logic to a single thread. Every act had been born from a certainty that reality must obey an imposed order. The story, however, was more than horror. It exposed a community's fragility and the way loneliness can act like a virus, consuming surrounding forms of life. If the mother had imposed a code, the town had left room for eccentricity. When boundaries failed, indifference and early fear let someone isolate until his private ideas hardened into totalities. The account became a warning. Darkness feeds on abandonment. Years later, documentaries and lady-night tellings kept the name alive. Obsessive fans sought every remnant: official photos, court notes, mythology. Little mattered if reality was less spectacular than fiction. Culture only needed the feeling left behind, a troubling assurance that proximity plus madness can spawn human monstrosity. The house and its man became a mirror in which society saw fragments of itself: neglect, solitude, an authoritarian voice that imposed itself without regard for life. As the narrative spread, other tales echoed the pattern: people who, in isolation, build private universes with no moral borders. Only the setting shifted. At the core remained the same: the human urge to clutch something lost and the perverse ways that impulse can manifest. The reporter kept clippings, interview notes, and transcripts. She knew publication would bring questions: why, how, and how to stop it. She wanted to offer more than a sensational account, She aimed to respect victims and provide context. She also knew audiences craved emotion. Fear is easy to sell. So she sought balance, avoiding recreating images for gore's sake and instead showing the chain of cause and effect that led to those acts. Still, the story could not escape its nature. Some passages slid toward the visceral because the facts themselves were visceral. The horror was not a flourish. It lived in suspicious utensils, strange seams, and notes about turning absence into something tactile. The challenge was to do justice to the truth without turning suffering into spectacle. She tried not to cross that line. Over the years, many works borrowed from the case. Fiction distilled core elements: the farmhouse, the domineering mother, the solitary son's need to convert bodies into something tamed. Culture, famished for strong images, recycled those fragments until characters became icons. Some retellings favored rawness. Others softened the edges for mass consumption. In each adaptation, something was lost. In others, something new emerged, a moral fable here, a jump scare there. What remained unanswered was less about the objects discovered than about how a mind could come to believe with such certainty that death might fix his world. What upbringing and isolation produced that response? Which part of a community bears responsibility for allowing someone to live so estranged that his beliefs become self-sustaining? Answers were uncomfortable, and few wanted them. There was no single cause stored in the house. The tragedy was a composite, a network of small omissions, unshakable beliefs, and silences that swallowed warnings. In that sense, the calamity was collective, born from accumulated neglect. The reporter closed her notebook with the feeling that she had touched something that would not be forgotten. Not for the sensational finds, but because the case showed how one life can be twisted into an excuse for the unthinkable. When she published, she avoided appealing for compassion for the perpetrator. She aimed instead to illuminate the community. The story joined the cultural landscape, read, cited, adapted. Each time it was retold in the dark, it breathed again. Some details shifted. Others were added by the human habit of ornamenting fear. The farm, though demolished, lived on in imagination. The man remained in files and public memory. Before ending this account, the reporter learned something from interviews and late nights. Fear does not always come from blood and bodies. Often it springs from what isolation does to a human mind. When that solitude mixes with an unbending doctrine, the result can be devastating. Thank you for listening. Subscribe. Leave a comment if it unsettled you. And once again, give me all your fear.